Turn that off right now. You're waking the whole neighborhood." The words, sharp and brittle, sliced through the pre-dawn stillness, a jarring violation of his sacred quiet. At 6:15 in the morning, with a blizzard raging and the world painted in shades of white and gray, HOA President Priscilla Thornfield was marching up my driveway. Encased in what I could only assume were $1,000 UGG boots, she brandished a cease and desist letter like a weapon. She was screaming, threatening me with daily fines of $500 because my Snowblower was, in her words, disturbing the peace. The hypocrisy was so thick, I could practically taste it. For 15 years, I've been the one to clear every single driveway in this community, a free service born from grief and a need for purpose. Now this newcomer, Karen wanted to penalize me for maintaining my own property. "It's 6:15 a.m. on my own land, Priscilla. It's perfectly legal. You're just a grumpy old man who doesn't follow modern rules." Her retort hung in the frozen air between us, each word a tiny, crystalline puff of condensation. For a moment, I just stared, and then it clicked. A slow, satisfying realization dawned in the cold recesses of my mind. She had just picked a fight with a retired land surveyor. And that road, the very asphalt she had driven on to deliver her baseless threat, she might want to double-check who exactly holds the deed to it. My name is Marcus Kellerman. I'm 58 years old, a widower, and a retired land surveyor. For as long as most residents can remember, I've been the man clearing the snow in this neighborhood, long before half of these oversized houses even broke ground. This corner lot, my 5 acres of sanctuary, is the last remnant of my grandfather's original farm. He worked 160 acres of this Colorado prairie until 1987, his hands as tough as the land itself. When the developers began circling like vultures in the early 2000s, my wife Sarah and I held onto our peace. We watched as they erected Willowbrook Estates around us, our modest home and sprawling yard becoming a sort of living historical monument amid the beige conformity. In the basement office, the musty, sweet scent of my grandfather's old survey maps still permeates the air. They're rolled up in sturdy metal tubes, stored alongside the precision instruments of my own career. That equipment, the Leica theodolite with its cold brass body, the heavy surveyor's chains, the steel measuring tapes, taught me a profound respect for property rights, a respect that is etched into my very soul. Most people see land as a commodity. I see it as a story, a legal text written in meters and bounds, a history that predates us all. Sarah passed 3 years ago. Her battle with cancer was brutal, and it left me rattling around in an empty house, crushed by a grief so immense it felt physical. I could barely function. That's when the 6 a.m. snowblowing began. It wasn't just a chore. It was therapy. It was essential. The deep vibration of the engine traveling up my arms through my gloved hands, the satisfying crunch of fresh powder under my steel-toed boots, the clean scrape of metal on concrete. It became my meditation, a way to impose order on a world that felt chaotic and meaningless. For 15 years, every time it snowed, I cleared everyone's driveway. No charge. I did it for Mrs. Henderson, whose arthritic hands couldn't grip a shovel. I did it for the Martinez twins, who were too small to navigate the massive snow drifts between their front door and the family car. Even old Bill's ancient golden retriever came to expect his morning treat from the crazy neighbor who was out working before the sun. My surveying background meant I knew every property line by heart, every drainage easement, every utility right-of-way. This was my community, and that was how I served it. Then she moved in. Priscilla Thornfield arrived, not like a new neighbor, but like a conquering army in the summer of 2020. She brought with her a white Tesla Model X, a law degree from UC Berkeley, and the kind of calculated predatory smile that makes you instinctively check your wallet. Within 60 days, she had managed to get herself elected HOA president during a Zoom meeting that half the neighborhood couldn't figure out how to join. Her property enhancement initiative began almost immediately. Her first target was Mrs. Henderson's 40-year-old rose garden, which was suddenly reclassified as non-conforming landscaping. Next on her list was Bill's vintage pickup truck. It hadn't moved in 5 years, but according to Priscilla, it detracted from a neighborhood's curb appeal. The acrid smell of freshly printed legal notices soon became as common as the scent of morning coffee. But what truly made my blood boil was the way she spoke to the longtime residents, as if we were dusty museum exhibits. "How charming that you still do manual labor, Marcus," she would chirp, all while installing her 6th Ring doorbell to monitor our compliance levels. Her voice had that particular high-pitched frequency that comes from years of speaking down to people she considers her intellectual inferiors. Her monthly newsletters arrived on cardstock so thick you could build furniture with it, printed in perfect fonts under an embossed letterhead, detailing rules written in dense legalese designed to intimidate and confuse. No RVs in driveways. No visible garbage. No unapproved outdoor equipment storage, which apparently included my Snowblower sitting quietly in my own garage. What Priscilla never seemed to grasp was the fundamental difference between a neighborhood and a corporate campus. When you've spent 32 years of your life mapping boundaries, you develop a bone-deep, almost religious respect for the sanctity of private property. But she treated the entire subdivision like her personal kingdom and the longtime residents like feudal subjects in desperate need of education in modern community standards. Her daily power walks, always performed in $200 athletic where that had never seen a bead of actual sweat, were reconnaissance missions. She would photograph any perceived violation with military precision. Christmas lights still up past January 15th, sprinklers running 1 minute beyond their allotted time. My coffee mug left on my own front step. So, on that December morning, when she stomped through the pristine snow in her $1,000 boots, waving legal threats like some suburban sheriff, she crossed a line. Not just my property line, though that was about to become critically important, but the unwritten, sacred covenant that neighbors help neighbors without getting lawyers involved. She wanted to teach an old man about modern rules. What she failed to realize was that this old man had spent his entire career reading the original maps, the very documents that showed exactly who owned what in her so-called modern community. Priscilla's first official move came a mere 48 hours after our driveway confrontation. It was a formal complaint filed with the Jefferson County Code Enforcement Division. I found a notice taped to my front door on a Tuesday morning, right next to the spot where I usually set my coffee mug. The official county seal was pressed into the cream-colored paper, alleging a violation of Municipal Ordinance 847.3. Excessive noise during restricted hours. According to her meticulously worded complaint, my Snowblower constituted a recurring public nuisance that violated the county's 7 a.m. noise restriction. The irony was so potent, it was almost comical. She had filed a noise complaint against the very piece of equipment that enabled the entire neighborhood to function during a snowstorm. But Priscilla was far from finished. She was building a case. By Thursday, she had organized something she called the Peaceful Morning Coalition. In reality, it was just her 2 other recent California transplants who shared her worldview, and, surprisingly, Cranky Bill, who had apparently switched allegiances after she promised to overlook his vintage truck's permanent residence in his driveway. They launched a campaign on the neighborhood social media app, Nextdoor, with the dramatic title, "Protecting Our Children's Sleep." The post was complete with Ring doorbell footage of my 6:15 a.m. Snowblower operation, edited to look as disruptive as possible. The comment section immediately devolved into digital warfare. Mrs. Henderson, bless her heart, posted photos of her perfectly clear driveway with the caption, "Marcus is a blessing to this neighborhood." The Martinez family shared a video of their twins playing safely in their snow-free driveway, free from the danger of slipping on ice. But Priscilla's coalition fired back with a barrage of pseudoscientific data, decibel readings they'd supposedly taken, studies on the negative impact of noise on property values, and vague threats to escalate this matter to the appropriate authorities. That's when my 32 years of dealing with municipal bureaucracy kicked into gear. I had spent decades navigating the labyrinthine corridors of county planning offices, and I remembered something from my surveying days about noise ordinance exemptions. A quick trip down to the Jefferson County Planning Department confirmed what I had suspected. Municipal Ordinance 847.3, the one Priscilla was banking on, had some fine print that her UC Berkeley law degree had apparently caused her to miss. The 7 a.m. restriction applied only to non-essential recreational activities. Essential property maintenance, however, was specifically protected between the hours of 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. under the Colorado Property Maintenance Code. My snowblower wasn't recreational equipment. It was essential winter maintenance, legally protected by the same codes that allowed roofers to start hammering at dawn. Armed with this knowledge, I compile my response. It was a thorough and irrefutable collection of evidence. 15 years of documented community service, photographs of every driveway I had cleared that week, and sworn testimony from a dozen grateful neighbors. The county dismissed Priscilla's complaint within 24 hours. But during my trip to the county office, while pulling the municipal records, I noticed something interesting in the subdivision planning files. I had requested the original plat maps for Willowbrook Estates, and something about the documentation for Oak Street, the main road into the subdivision, looked off. The city classified it as a public thoroughfare, but the measurements didn't quite match my grandfather's 1950s farm survey, which was still sitting in a tube in my basement. That evening, I pulled out his old Leica theodolite. The cold, heavy brass felt familiar and reassuring under my fingertips. As I set up in my front yard, I made a show of checking my fence line for any curious onlookers, but I was actually measuring something far more intriguing. As the precision instrument revealed the exact boundary markers, a startling truth began to emerge. Oak Street wasn't just adjacent to my property. A 40-foot wide strip of it ran directly across land that had never been sold, condemned, or legally transferred to public use. Every single neighbor, every single day, had been driving across my private property for 15 years. Just as I was recording the final measurements, Priscilla's Tesla crept past. Her phone was pressed against the passenger side window, obviously photographing my suspicious surveying activity. The irony was exquisite. The woman who was trying to control my property rights was, at that very moment, literally trespassing on my land to gather evidence against me. She had no idea that she was driving across the very property I was documenting, but her surveillance gave me a perfect photo opportunity of my own. I captured a clear shot of her car on my land, with her phone visible in the window. My formal response to her now-dismissed county complaint landed on the HOA's desk that Friday morning like a legal grenade. It was 8 pages long, proving that my snowblower operation was completely lawful, complete with constitutional property rights precedents and municipal code citations. When Priscilla learned that the county had dismissed her complaint, her response was swift and predictable. A Saturday post on Nextdoor accused me of weaponizing legal technicalities and intimidating neighbors with surveying equipment. She announced an emergency HOA board meeting to discuss problem, neighbor mitigation strategies, and declared that my property maintenance was deliberately hostile to community standards. The smell of battle hung in the cold December air, a peculiar mixture of diesel exhaust from my snowblower and the expensive, cloying perfume Priscilla wore during her daily surveillance walks. She wanted to escalate this into a legal war, apparently convinced that her law degree trumped my 32 years of property rights experience. The next morning, I fired up the snowblower at exactly 7 a.m. It was completely legal, but perfectly timed to remind everyone who actually kept this neighborhood functional during the winter. As the engine roared to life, I caught a glimpse of Priscilla's silhouette behind her designer curtains, a figure rigid with fury at having lost the first round. She had started a property rights war with someone who understood property better than she understood neighborhoods. And those measurements I had been taking were about to turn her morning commute into a very educational experience. Priscilla's emergency HOA board meeting was a spectacle of suburban warfare. I wasn't officially invited, of course. Apparently, my hostile and disruptive behavior disqualified me from any discussion about my own conduct. But Mrs. Henderson, a woman who had lived in this valley her entire life, texted me live updates from her seat in the back row. Priscilla, she reported, had prepared a PowerPoint presentation. The title was Addressing Disruptive Residents, Legal Options, and Community Protection. It was 23 slides long. About me. The presentation included photos of my surveying equipment, a detailed timeline of my snowblowing schedule, and what Mrs. Henderson described as a psychological profile that would make a real therapist cringe. Priscilla was suggesting that I exhibited concerning antisocial behaviors consistent with grief-related mental health episodes. She was weaponizing Sarah's death, painting me as an unstable widower who needed community intervention. Her grand proposal was a special HOA assessment of $200 per household to fund a legal defense initiative against my pattern of neighborhood harassment. She wanted every single one of my neighbors to pay for lawyers to shut down my snowblowing. But Priscilla had completely misread the room. Mrs. Henderson stood up during the public comment section and delivered what she later described as 40 years of pent-up rage about entitled California transplants. 3 other longtime residents followed her lead, each one pointing out that I had collectively saved them thousands of dollars in snow removal costs over the years. The Martinez family even showed up with their twins, who, according to their father, had been asking, "Where's Mr. Marcus?" every morning when they couldn't find me clearing their driveway. The vote on her legal fund failed 4-3. It wasn't a unanimous show of support for me, but it was enough to torpedo her plan. That's when Priscilla went for the throat. The next morning, 2 Jefferson County Sheriff's deputies were on my porch. They looked uncomfortable and were holding paperwork detailing a complaint about possible elder abuse and mental health concerns. She had actually called Adult Protective Services on me, claiming that my erratic surveying behavior and obsession with my property suggested a dangerous cognitive decline. The sheer audacity of it left me speechless. But these deputies weren't rookies. They had clearly seen weaponized wellness checks before. After 15 minutes of discussing my military service, my professional background, and my current mental state, they closed the case with a note that I was clearly competent and functioning independently. As a patrol car pulled away, something clicked in my brain. I had seen this exact pattern play out during my surveying career. Newcomers moving into established areas and then discovering inconvenient property realities they couldn't change through intimidation. Usually, it involved fence lines or water rights, but the psychology was identical. That evening, for the first time since Sarah's funeral, I found myself in the basement, spreading my grandfather's original survey maps across my workbench. The yellowed paper felt fragile and brittle under my fingertips. Decades of Colorado dust motes danced in the fluorescent light. These weren't just family memorabilia. They were legal documents that predated everything Priscilla thought she understood about this neighborhood. I had been so focused on noise ordinances and HOA bylaws, fighting Priscilla's war on her terms. But as I traced the original property boundaries with my finger, following the precise ink lines my grandfather had drawn in 1950, I realized I had been thinking too small. The western edge of the original farm, the strip of land where Oak Street now ran, had never actually been sold to the subdivision developers. I remember my grandfather telling stories about keeping the back 40 for family access, but I had always assumed he meant the undeveloped land behind the houses. I was wrong. He had meant the road. Every single morning, when Priscilla drove her Tesla down Oak Street to deliver her legal threats, she was crossing a 40-foot wide strip of Kellerman family land that had never legally changed ownership. The subdivision had been built with the assumption that they would eventually acquire the proper road easements. But the financial crisis of 2008 had bankrupted the developer before the paperwork was ever completed. For 15 years, 47 families had been driving across my private property twice a day, and none of them knew it. A certified letter from the law firm of Hartwell, Morrison, and Associates arrived the next day. It felt like validation. Priscilla had hired a boutique HOA law firm with her own money, demanding that I cease all intimidation tactics, including my surveying activities and hostile interactions. They threatened restraining orders and civil action for intentional infliction of emotional distress. Reading their legal threats while sitting on a property rights gold mine felt surreal. These lawyers were building a case around neighbor disputes and noise complaints, completely unaware that their own client had been trespassing to file those complaints in the first place. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and my grandfather's deed, watching Priscilla's headlights sweep across my front window as she returned from another day of building her case against me. The heavy paper of the deed felt warm under my fingertips, the 70-year-old ink still sharp and legally binding. She thought she was educating an old man about modern community standards. What she had actually done was give a property rights expert the perfect motivation to dust off some very old and very enforceable legal documents. The war she wanted was about to get much more interesting than noise complaints. My Friday morning was quiet. I was legally banned from starting my snowblower until 8 a.m., so I sat in my kitchen, staring at my grandfather's deed and feeling utterly defeated. That's when I noticed it, something I had missed in 15 years of looking at this document. The property description wasn't just for the 5 acres where my house now sits. Hidden in the dense legal language, buried between the heretofore and wherefores, was a phrase that made my coffee grow cold. Accepting and reserving unto grantor perpetual access rights to the westernmost 40-foot strip for agricultural and residential purposes. My hands trembled as I traced the words with my finger. My grandfather hadn't just sold the farm to the developers. He had kept a 40-foot strip of access rights that ran exactly where Oak Street now existed. I had been fighting Priscilla over noise ordinances and HOA bylaws while sitting on a property rights nuclear weapon. The musty smell of old paper filled my nostrils as I spread the deed flat on my kitchen table, studying every word as if it were a treasure map. The heavy ink, pressed deep into the fiber by a 1950s typewriter, spelled out something that was about to change 47 families' lives forever. But I needed confirmation. I called Danny Kowalski, my old Army buddy who had spent the last 30 years untangling property law messes for ranchers and developers. Danny, I said, I need you to look at something. Can you meet me this morning? He arrived within the hour, took one look at the deed, and went absolutely silent for 3 full minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Jesus Christ, Marcos. Do you understand what this means? Tell me. When Apex Development went bankrupt in 2009, these reserved rights didn't transfer to the homeowners or the city. They reverted to the original landowner. You. That road was built across your private property without compensation, without permission, and without any legal easement. The implications hit me like a series of physical blows. Every morning commute, every grocery store run, every trip to school or work. For 15 years, 47 families have been trespassing on Kellerman land twice a day. Danny pulled out his phone and started making calls to the county recorder's office, his voice taking on the excited, predatory tone of a lawyer who had just found gold. I need to see the complete chain of title for the Willow Brook Estate subdivision, he said into the phone. Yes, I'll hold on. While he waited, I walked to my front window and watched the morning traffic on Oak Street. Priscilla's Tesla cruised past, followed by young families heading to work, elderly neighbors running errands. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that their road access existed solely at my discretion. It's confirmed, Danny said, hanging up the phone. No recorded easement, no condemnation proceedings, no dedication to public use. The city has been maintaining a road they don't own, providing access to houses that were sold with fraudulent title guarantees. The power of that knowledge felt intoxicating. After weeks of being painted as an unstable old man who didn't understand modern neighborhoods, I was holding legal documents that proved everyone else had been wrong about everything. But Danny's next discovery made my blood pressure spike. I did some background research on your HOA president while I was at it, he said. Priscilla Thornfield has 3 ethical violations on her California law license, all involving property disputes where she deliberately misrepresented ownership issues. She had done this before? in another state, to other people. Sitting there with my grandfather's deed in my hands, watching Priscilla's morning surveillance drive past my window, I felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of this conflict. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute that had gotten out of hand. This was a predator who had picked the wrong prey. The next morning, I woke up with the kind of dangerous clarity that comes from finally holding all the cards in a game you've been losing for months. Danny arrived at 8 a.m., carrying a leather briefcase scarred from 3 decades of property wars. As we spread the maps across my dining room table, my grandfather's deed, the subdivision plat, the county records, the weight of what I was about to do settled in my chest like cold lead. "You sure about this, Marcus?" Danny asked, studying my face. "Once you start down this road, there's no backing up. 47 families are going to hate your guts." The question hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. For 15 years, I had been the neighborhood's unofficial caretaker. Now, I was about to become its worst nightmare. "Priscilla made this personal," I said, tracing the path of Oak Street in the survey map. "She wanted to teach me about modern rules. It's time for her to learn about some old ones." Danny's plan was elegantly brutal. A legal notice sent to every homeowner, giving them 30 days to negotiate an easement agreement or lose all road access. It wasn't revenge. It was just business, wrapped in the unassailable logic of constitutional property rights. My shopping trip to Mountain States surveying felt like preparation for war. The familiar weight of the precision instruments reminded me of why I had loved this profession so much. Everything was measurable. Everything was definitive. Everything was backed by the certainty of law and mathematics. I purchased a state-of-the-art laser level and GPS equipment. It was time to document every inch of my property boundaries with courtroom-ready precision. My next stop was the Denver Steel and Gate Company. They specialized in the kind of heavy-duty vehicle barriers that make statements impossible to ignore. The showroom smelled of metal and machine oil, sounds and scents that reminded me of my grandfather's workshop. Rodriguez, the sales manager, was a retired Marine who understood the psychology of controlled access. "You want to stop traffic or send a message?" he asked. "Both," I replied. The gate specifications read like military hardware. A 12-foot steel swing barrier, hydraulically operated, with keypad access and an emergency override. It was made of quarter-inch plate steel that could stop a pickup truck, mounted on posts that would be anchored 3 feet deep in the dense Colorado clay. "This isn't coming down without heavy equipment," Rodriguez said, marking the installation requirements on the contract. "That's the idea," I said. The permit application at the Jefferson County office felt surreal. The planning clerk processed my private property security enhancement request with bureaucratic efficiency. "Have the affected neighbors been notified?" she asked. "They will be," I replied, "properly and legally." The permit was approved in under an hour. Apparently, installing a fortress-grade gate on your own property raises zero official concerns when you follow the correct procedures. But the real weapon was Danny's legal correspondence. We spent an afternoon drafting the notice of trespass termination letters, one for every household in Willowbrook. The language was clinical, dispassionate, and devastating. It gave them 30 days to negotiate legal access or find an alternative route to their own homes. Each envelope contained a copy of my grandfather's deed, the current survey documentation, and Danny's business card. It was professional, respectful, and absolutely terrifying to anyone who understood real estate law. "The beauty of this," Danny explained as we addressed the envelopes, "is that you're not attacking anyone. You're just clarifying who owns what." That evening, I stood in my driveway and watched the normal flow of neighborhood life on Oak Street. Kids riding their bikes, families returning from dinner, Mrs. Henderson walking her ancient Cocker Spaniel. All of it was about to change forever. The gate components arrived in an unmarked truck. The steel plates were so heavy they required specialized equipment for installation. Pete, the crew chief, had obviously handled sensitive projects before. "Do you want this installed quietly, or do you want the whole neighborhood to know something's happening?" he asked. "I want it installed permanently," I replied. "The neighborhood will figure out the rest." As Pete's crew began marking the concrete locations, I noticed Priscilla's Tesla creeping past during her evening surveillance ritual. She couldn't see the gate components from the street, but the sight of hard hats and surveying equipment on my property had clearly triggered her paranoia. She had no idea that her worst fears about my surveying activities were about to become her new reality. The war she had started with legal papers and restraining orders was about to become very physical and very permanent. The showdown everyone had been building toward arrived on a Thursday evening at the Willowbrook Community Center. Priscilla had organized what she called an emergency public hearing on property rights versus community safety. I had never seen the community center so packed. Every folding chair was occupied, people were standing along the walls, and local news crews were setting up their cameras in the back. The air hummed with tension, the nervous energy of a community that knew it was about to witness something decisive. Priscilla had clearly prepared for this moment, like a trial lawyer presenting her closing argument. Professional easel displays showed emergency response time calculations, property value projections, and aerial photos of my gate blocking the access to Oak Street. Her PowerPoint presentation was titled, "When Individual Rights Threaten Community Welfare." She took the podium with an air of complete confidence, her voice carrying across the packed room with practiced legal authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "we're here tonight because one man's property obsession has created a crisis affecting 47 families, our emergency services, and our entire community's economic stability." The presentation that followed was a masterfully crafted piece of emotional manipulation. She had testimony from parents about their children's psychological trauma from feeling trapped. She had Fire Chief Williams expressing his concerns about response times. She had a real estate agent, Sandra Lopez, presenting data about projected property value decline. "This isn't about legitimate property rights," Priscilla concluded. "This is about an elderly man using legal technicalities to hold an entire neighborhood hostage over a simple snow-blowing complaint." The applause was substantial. Half the room clearly saw me as the villain in this story. Then it was my turn. I approached the microphone carrying a simple manila folder, feeling the weight of 73 years of Kellerman family ownership on my shoulders. Danny sat in the front row, his confident expression telling me he was ready for what was about to happen. Before we talk about property rights versus community welfare, I began opening my folder. I think everyone should understand exactly whose property we're discussing. I held up my grandfather's 1950 farm deed, the yellowed paper clearly visible to the front rows. This document shows that my family has owned the land under Oak Street since before any of your houses existed. A murmur rippled through the crowd as people began to understand the implications. "Mrs. Thornfield has spent the last 6 months telling everyone that I don't understand modern community standards," I continued. "But she's never bothered to research the legal history of this community." I pulled out Danny's chain of title research, the county planning documents, and the subdivision maps that showed the gaping chasm between legal reality and everyone's assumptions. Every house in Willowbrook Estates was sold with title insurance guaranteeing access via Oak Street, I explained. But Oak Street was never properly acquired for my family. For 15 years, 47 households have been using private property without permission, compensation, or a legal easement. The room went absolutely silent as the magnitude of the problem became clear. "This isn't one man holding a community hostage," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "This is a community that has just discovered it was built on someone else's land." Priscilla shot to her feet, her composure finally cracking. "That's ridiculous. The city maintains that road. It appears on all the municipal maps." "Municipal maps can be wrong, Mrs. Thornfield," I said calmly. "Property deeds aren't." That's when Danny stood up and delivered the bombshell we had been saving for this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice ringing with authority, "I'm Daniel Kowalski, and I represent Mr. Kellerman. 3 days ago, we filed a formal notice with the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office regarding fraudulent legal documents that were submitted in this case." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mrs. Thornfield obtained a temporary injunction last week by representing to the court that Oak Street was public property. She knew from our previous correspondence that this was false. Filing legal documents containing known falsehoods constitutes perjury under Colorado law. Priscilla's face went white as she realized what Danny was saying. Furthermore, he continued, she conducted unauthorized surveying on private property and filed false reports with state investigators. The Attorney General's office has opened a criminal investigation into these matters. The news cameras were rolling as Priscilla's carefully constructed case collapsed in real time. Councilwoman Martinez was frantically checking her phone, presumably getting legal advice on how quickly she could distance herself from this impending disaster. So, here's what's going to happen, I said, returning to the microphone. I am prepared to sell legal easement rights to this community for the symbolic price of $1. But there are 3 conditions. The room held its collective breath. First, I said, Mrs. Thornfield resigned from the HOA board, effective immediately. Second, the harassment against me and the other longtime residents of this community stops permanently. And third, we establish a community fund for neighborhood maintenance, because apparently some people have forgotten what good neighbors actually do for each other. The applause started with Mrs. Henderson. It spread through the longtime residents before reaching the newer families, who now realized they were being offered a reasonable solution to an impossible problem. Priscilla stood frozen at her easel, her legal career and her neighborhood reputation destroyed by her own overreach. Sometimes, the best revenge is just letting people destroy themselves in public. The easement paperwork was signed within 48 hours, witnessed by more neighbors than had ever attended an HOA meeting in Willowbrook's history. Priscilla's resignation letter arrived that same weekend. A brief, bitter note about relocating for career opportunities that fooled no one. Her white Tesla disappeared from the neighborhood 3 days later, followed by a moving truck that worked with a quiet, almost shameful efficiency. The criminal investigation Danny had mentioned was real and thorough. The district attorney's office eventually decided against prosecution in exchange for Priscilla's full cooperation in correcting the fraudulent court filings and her agreement to seek professional help for what they diplomatically termed stress-related professional misconduct. Her law license suspension became a matter of public record 3 months later. But the real transformation was in the neighborhood itself. The new HOA board elected Mrs. Henderson as president. Their first official act was to establish the Sarah Kellerman Memorial Community Fund. Every household now contributes $25 a month, less than they used to spend on private snow, removal services, and more than enough to maintain the equipment, fund neighborhood improvements, and provide emergency assistance for the elderly residents. The fund's first project was the installation of a beautiful memorial garden at the intersection where Oak Street meets my property line. Sarah would have loved the irony. The very spot where all this conflict began is now marked by roses, benches, and a small plaque that reads, "In memory of neighbors who serve neighbors." My morning snowblowing ritual resumed the following December, but now it comes with backup. The Martinez teenagers bought their own equipment and now handle the driveways of the younger families. Mrs. Henderson has trained 3 other retirees on the proper technique for operating the community-owned Snowblower. Even Cranky Bill emerged from his house last winter with an ancient snow shovel, muttering something about doing his part for once. The community dynamics have shifted in ways I never could have expected. People wave when they drive past my gate, which remains permanently open but now serves as a daily reminder to respect property rights. New neighbors receive a proper orientation from the longtime residents about Willowbrook's unique history and values. The Nextdoor app has transformed from a digital battlefield into an actual community resource for organizing block parties and sharing tools. Most importantly, we started talking to each other again, instead of at each other through lawyers and social media posts. Jessica Finley's follow-up story, 6 months later, focused on conflict resolution and community healing. Her piece, titled, "How a Snowplowing Dispute Became a Neighborhood Transformation," won a regional journalism award, and still gets shared whenever HOA horror stories trend on social media. The Sarah Kellerman Memorial Fund has grown beyond its original purpose. Last year, we funded college scholarships for 3 local students who are pursuing careers in the skilled trades. This year, we're partnering with Habitat for Humanity to build affordable housing in Jefferson County. The fund that started with neighborhood snow removal now supports construction projects across the state. But the personal healing has been just as meaningful as the community changes. I still miss Sarah every morning when I fire up the snowblower. But now those moments feel more like a quiet communion than a manifestation of grief. She would be proud that her memory became the catalyst for something positive, rather than just another reason for neighbors to tear each other apart over property lines and hurt feelings. My surveying equipment sits cleaned and organized in my garage, ready for action if any boundary disputes ever arise again. But these days, new neighbors knock on my door to ask questions rather than filing complaints with county offices. They've learned that 32 years of professional experience is a resource, not a threat. This spring, I'm teaching a basic property law workshop at the community center titled Understanding Your Deed and Your Rights. Because, apparently, half the homeowners in Jefferson County have no idea what they actually own versus what they merely assume they own. Danny jokes that I should start charging consulting fees for helping other communities resolve their property disputes before they escalate to all-out legal warfare. Maybe he's right. There's something deeply satisfying about preventing conflicts instead of just winning them. But mostly, I'm content just being the neighborhood's unofficial property rights expert, its snow removal coordinator, and the keeper of its institutional memory, a constant reminder of what can happen when good neighbors forget how to be good neighbors.